My name is Jonathan Kay. I'm with the National Post, and with me is Gwynne Dyer, noted Canadian journalist and historian, and publisher this week of Canada in the Great Power Game 1914 to 2014, focusing a lot on the First World War, but also many other historical events. Mr. Dyer, welcome.
Thank you, Joe.
I'd like to start off by reading a brief quote. This is a letter you dug up, a letter to the editor, Paris, Ontario, and someone opining on what would happen if the Germans won. And the letter writer said, if the Germans are victorious, the very first thing they would do would be to take over Canada. They would fill every city, town, and village and hold drunken, debauching orgies in celebrating their victory, and our women and children would be the victim of these drunken, barbarous wretches. Tell me something, was this a prevalent view among ordinary Canadians?
Not quite. I think that's a little bit extreme because many Canadians knew enough geography to understand it's a really long swim across the Atlantic.
Yeah.
But the larger view that somehow we had a dog in this fight, and if we lost, we, the Allies, we, or the British Empire lost, something bad would happen to Canada. That was there. And of course it wasn't true.
But of course, there were varying views. I think it's widely known that Quebec was less enthusiastic about the war than the rest of Canada.
You could put it that way.
But
yeah.
you also show that even among Anglo-Canadians, there was a sharp divergence between different groups. What was the primary split there?
Well, it's between the native-born and the recent immigrants. I mean, the English-Canadian population in 1914 was actually mostly of British descent. I mean, this was before the rest of the world immigrated here, and so we had, sort of an ethnically British population. But the distinction was between those who'd been here long enough to figure out where in the world they lived, and those who just arrived and still thought of Britain as the mother country, and didn't make a distinction between Britain and Canada. I mean, what's quite interesting is that the longer settled parts of the country, which in the case of English Canada means the Maritimes, had far lower volunteering rates than like Alberta or British Columbia, recently settled and full of recent British immigrants. Even though you think of this as sort of loyalist territory in the East, they weren't volunteering. And of course, the longest settled part of the country, above all, was French Canada.
Yeah.
And they had no illusions about where they lived in the world. It's North America, and we're not in danger. Whatever we do in this or any other war is going to be voluntary because we're not at risk.
August 1914, the Canadians who did volunteer for the war, what do you think their expectation was of how long they'd be in Europe?
Oh, 4 months, 6 months. I mean, actually, I remember talking to a whole group of this was obviously before 15, 20 years ago because they're all gone now. A group of Canadians who'd volunteered, actually most of them recent British immigrants, in 1914, went over with the first contingent. And their major concern was that they wouldn't get to Europe in time to see the war by the end of 1914. They also thought, what a wonderful opportunity. People didn't travel much in those days. We'll get to see Europe. And yes, there'll be a war, and it will be tough in bits, but 90% of us, 95% of us will come home. All of those assumptions, of course, completely false. But nobody foresaw, or nobody in authority foresaw, what this war was going to be like. I mean, it just happened that the weapons had all changed and got very much more efficient at killing, and we could put huge armies in the field because we had the money to sustain large armies in the field, and all of a sudden the scale of the thing goes tenfold bigger. The loss rates among the Canadians who went overseas, 600,000 Canadians served overseas in the First World War, which is amazing when you consider that English Canada and French Canadians weren't going. English Canada had about 5.5 million people
in
1914.
10%.
So yeah, and of those who went overseas, about 220,000 were killed or wounded.
Wow.
So 1 in 3, or a little bit more than 1 in 3. 65,000 killed and the rest wounded. And yet, when the Second World War came along, they volunteered again, I think. And I didn't always think this, but I've talked to a lot of people about it, and I think the reason that we went on sending people to wars had to do after World War I with the debt we felt we owed to those who had been killed or wounded in that. Because if we didn't do it again, we're implicitly saying it was a waste to do it the first time. It didn't make sense. We were wrong. And that would be betraying them.
One final question, because your book, obviously, although the publication is timed to the 100th anniversary at the beginning of World War I, it's about much else in Canadian history. Could you sum up for viewers how World War I changed the fabric of Canadian life beyond everything people already know about our growing independence from Britain and that sort of thing? In terms of the fabric of Canadian life, how was it different after World War I?
Well, first thing is that the divide between English and French Canadians grew into a gulf. I mean, because we in the end brought in conscription. English Canada brought in conscription and said the French had to go too. There was machine guns deployed in the streets of Quebec City in 1918, and it was the Canadian Army machine gunning French Canadians. So, I mean, it got very serious. Mercifully, the war ended just after that. But so the level of distrust of English Canadian instincts in French Canada never dropped back to normal after that. And, of course, we went through the same thing in the Second World War. Among English Canadians, it certainly did have this. I don't think, this the Prime Minister recently said our identity was forged in the trenches of the First World War. Hang on a minute, we already knew who we were. But it was the first great collective enterprise that Canadians had engaged in. And so in that sense, yes. It left a huge mark on us in the sense that now we knew we could do, in this case, not a very wise thing perhaps, but do large things collectively. That's kind of forging a national identity, and I think that certainly has persisted with good results and bad, because one of the bad results is we keep on doing it.
Well, Mr. Dyer, congratulations on the publication of your book, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much.